And welcome back, everyone, to Live Now from Fox. I'm your host, Mike Pache. Always great to be with you as we continue to roll on. Next up, I want to bring you to the White House here as the latest updates coming from the White House blaming the Biden administration over Operation Allies Welcome. This operation was born in the midst of the Afghanistan withdrawal back in 2021. And this really comes back into headlines because on Wednesday, the Afghan man who is suspected of shooting two National Guard members in Washington, D.C., was in the U.S. after entering the country in 2021 under a program called Operation Allies Welcome. So this is a posting on X from Scott Turner, Secretary Turner, saying HUD terminated Operation Allies Welcome days into the Trump administration. The days of unchecked American taxpayer dollars to the flood of illegals are over. I want to continue to talk about this program and really the checks and balances that went into it right here with more. Hal Kempfer, national security analyst. Always great to have you on, Hal. And yeah, this Afghanistan withdrawal really coming back into focus given everything that happened on Wednesday.
Mike, Allies Welcome was, of course, that was something that was in, August 2021. That was during the Biden administration that we had this huge influx of Afghan nationals that was coming to the U.S., many of which, if not everyone that came over, but someone in every family had either worked directly with the U.S., U.S. forces, U.S. agencies or organizations, like as in the case of Lakanwal, the shooter in Washington, D.C., he was tied to working with special forces and the CIA. And so they had worked very closely with us. And as such, when the Taliban took over, you ended up with a situation where they were basically targeted. They would have been high-profile targets. That very good chance that they and their families may not have survived the Taliban. So we provided them a place to go, which was eventually to resettle in the United States. But and it's been fairly successful with a couple of exceptions, But of course the most notable exception is the one that we're dealing with now in the wake of the Washington, D.C. shootings of two members of the National Guard.
And how fast was this program really initiated? If we go back there to 2021, it was a real chaotic withdrawal.
It was, to use the military phrase, a real mess. Okay. It was really just both the commander at the time, the previous commander, had talked about this, and this was it was part of a plan that was put together under the Trump administration, but executed under the Biden administration. Both the commanders had felt that the planning, coordination, and certainly the committees that looked at this in the wake of our withdrawal had talked about the lack of coordination. I would personally point a finger at the lack of detailed planning that was necessary. I think there was a lot of politically driven assessments of what the Taliban were going to do or capable of doing that didn't really have a strong basis in reality. And the Taliban swept in very quickly. And what eventually came out of this was we pulled out. We made some big mistakes, not the least of which was we had a major airfield north of Kabul that we pulled out of before we pulled out of Kabul. That airfield was in a place that we could defend. It was a place where we controlled the territory, and it was away from an urban area. And yet we pulled out of that thing, and literally we disappeared in the night. The local Afghan national forces, working with us on our phased withdrawal, expected to see us in the morning, and that night we all hopped on planes and left, and everybody was gone. And of course, the Afghan national government looked at this and said, the Americans are literally just abandoning us to our fate. And that sudden collapse of any confidence in the Afghan people, certainly the security forces, that they had the capability of holding out against the Taliban takeover was what really did it. It gets into the will to fight, and they didn't really have a will to fight for a government and for a regime that they felt couldn't survive no matter what. And so it was just a rapid fire collapse across the line, much faster than what the U.S. had predicted was going to happen. And we were forced with what you saw at Kabul International Airport, where we're just throwing together this massive evacuation that looked rather haphazard and bringing folks over. Now, in the case of Lakanwal, he had been vetted multiple times over. You don't work for the CIA or work for Special Operations Forces without having a lot of background checks on you. He had been for many years a member of a very elite unit that we worked with that was going after high profile targets in Afghanistan, whether they're Al Qaeda or ISIS. They were involved with a lot of very sensitive strike missions, if you will, doing that. So wasn't someone we expected. He wasn't really high. If you were to pick somebody who's going to do something like this, wouldn't high on the list. But they keep. I've heard a lot of discussion about, well, he was radicalized here in the U.S. I want to see what that radicalization was, what they're referring to. I want to see the details on that, and then I also want to find out if that was his underlying motivation, or maybe he was particularly frustrated with U.S. policy regarding Afghanistan, and maybe the fear that Afghans were going to be forcibly resettled back into Taliban-held Afghanistan, which for many of them would be essentially a death sentence. So that I don't know what his motivation is. We'll find that out.
And Hal, I wonder, what do you think was going on behind the scenes Wednesday night, even on Thanksgiving, when the intelligence officials in our government were no doubt probably running the names of everyone through this Operation Allies. Maybe give us a glimpse of what was happening Wednesday night, probably even Thanksgiving as well.
They were clearly looking at any possible others that were out there. Obviously, with the one shooting, you look at everybody who's connected to him, everybody he's talking to. If he was radicalized here, who would have radicalized him? Were there other co-conspirators? You have to remember the day before that shooting took place, another Afghan national who'd come over that he was planning he had made threats of doing a bombing attack back in the Dallas-Fort Worth area of Texas, and that was thwarted. That was stopped. It was threats. There was no actual, physical conduct, if you will, operation of doing that. But it was enough to stop him from moving it forward with those plans. And it's got to make a lot of people uneasy that maybe we're missing something. Maybe we're not seeing what's right there in front of us. So they'd be going back and cross-checking all the names. I won't get into all the database specifics, but let's just say they'd be running names, they'd be running nicknames, they'd be running anything they possibly could, addresses, phone numbers, any piece of data, cross-checking that to find out if there's any connection to any radical discussion. And as names pop up as, oh, this person could have been somebody very much involved with radicalizing Lakanwal or someone else, then all of a sudden they look very close at the network around that person to find out, is there somebody else that we missed? And so it's kind of in a broad sense, and I know this is somewhat a data term, it's kind of a link analysis that you're building up links, and some of the software out there that can do things like this is pretty powerful, and it can show the power of the linkages through a variety of visual means, along with other ways that show these are people you need to look at. And so they're doing that. But of course, our overall thing that we did was just to simply make a policy decision, which is stop processing them for asylum. And while we go through this entire relook, and as of today, the White House is saying they're not giving a date on when they might lift that moratorium on processing for asylum.
Yeah, Hal, I want to show the response and really a statement from the White House earlier today. Caroline Leavitt saying the terrorist who gunned down American soldiers blocks away from the White House in an ambush was an Afghan national who was flown into our country by Joe Biden's administration. I want to play out just a little bit of sound from earlier with Caroline Leavitt talking about this situation.
You mentioned, or you emphasized that there would be a review of the Afghans who were resettled here under the previous administration.
Yes.
There's a lot of changes happening right now to asylum and to green card holders. What should the 2 million people with pending asylum claims, or the roughly million people from the 18 other countries of concern, know about what's going on in the review? What's the status of all these other people?
They're essentially paused for review, and the Department of Homeland Security is taking this very seriously, because we are not going to allow soldiers like we saw in American streets last week to be gunned down at the hands of these foreign nationals who had the privilege of coming to the United States of America. And unfortunately, this is not the only example of a dangerous Afghan who was let in by Joe Biden, who went on to harm the American people. There was an Afghan national who was let into the country under the Biden administration through Operation Allies Welcome, who shot and wounded 2 Fairfax, Virginia police officers during a routine traffic stop. He was killed by return fire after declaring, quote, "I should have served with the explicitive Taliban." 2 Afghan nationals were given legal status by the Biden administration as well, who were arrested and prosecuted for plotting a terrorist attack in Oklahoma just before Election Day in 2024. We all remember that. They possessed hundreds of rounds of ammunition and had pledged their allegiance to ISIS. There was also an Afghan national who was on the terror watch list, who was apprehended by Border Patrol in 2024, but then he was released into our country by the Biden administration. Again, let's just highlight the absurdity of that. Border Patrol apprehended a terrorist, and then the Biden administration, because of their lax policies, still allowed him to come into the United States of America. I think everyone in this room, whether you want to admit it or not, does not want that individual living alongside you in your American neighborhood. And that individual was later arrested again after being allowed to live in the U.S. at large for over a year. Another one, a criminal illegal alien from Afghanistan, was arrested by ICE in 2025, convicted of second-degree assault, was previously allowed to stay in the country by the Biden administration. I have several more examples here. I'm happy to provide them to anyone in this room.
All right, so that was from earlier today. I want to bring in Hal Kempfer back again for response here, as the White House really going to not them, but our officials in the intelligence really going to zero in on all of these names that came through.
They are. They're going to really look hard at that list. I should have said not a couple of exceptions, a few exceptions, obviously. And if you look at the vast numbers that came in, those are a few exceptions. But there are some, some do come over, and it is a bit of a culture shock to come from Afghanistan into the United States. And for many of them, they're also dealing with PTSD, and they are ripe for some sort of radicalization, indoctrination, recruitment from extremist groups like ISIS that are looking for ways to leverage the fact that they're in the United States. And you saw that clearly demonstrated with what was explained, that does happen. There's other things as well. If they get over here, they just can't fit in, and they have a tough time, and they get engaged in some very dangerous stuff. And for many of them, Afghanistan has been a country at war for decades. So war, guns, if you will, that's what many of them truly understand. And so it's not surprising you're going to see a few that would get involved in that stuff. But it's probably good that we're doing this big vetting. Although I would say that when they're looking at this problem, technically, yes, the plane that came in was when President Biden was the president. So that doesn't mean that Joe Biden personally flew them over, but yeah, anybody who came over during that period would definitely be under the Biden administration. But that was the execution thing, and I'm sure a number of Afghan national leaders would point out, yes, but it was the Trump administration, the first term, that negotiated directly with the Taliban, that did not invite the Afghan national government to even participate in those negotiations, and made basically an agreement with the Taliban that basically pushed the entire Afghan national government aside, that left open for this what eventually happened in 2021, and obviously the way that we dealt with the Afghan national government in that entire period was such that we basically pulled the rug out from under them and left them, somewhat twisting in the wind, if you will, as things were unfolding. And in some cases, Afghan national forces were actually fighting the Taliban, trying to slow their assault or turn back their assault. and they couldn't get air support because the U.S. had pulled out all of the things that they needed to get air support in Afghanistan, all the contract support for even their pilots and their planes and everything else. So it was there's enough blame to go around on that. But yes, technically, when they did fly out, it was 2021. That was President Biden's, that was his. He was president during that period of time, and that's just a simple reality. Is you will get blamed in the same way that John F. Kennedy is tied to the Bay of Pigs. That plan was well before he became president. That was under the Eisenhower administration, but when he was in there, that was when the plan was executed. And whether you knew it or not, you own the plan. And I would encourage any president, if you walk in and see an ongoing operation like that, you might take a little bit of time to research what's been done before you, particularly if you have significant doubts in the guy who held the office before you got there.
Yeah, such good details and analysis, Hal.